Mr. Panzironi. Tonight we are talking about a condition that is very common, but it is also a little bit forgotten because practically not even the doctors a little bit know what it is. I am talking about lymphedema, and let's see together what it is.
About lymphedema, I would gladly talk even before patients to doctors, because lymphedema hardly anyone knows about it. It is a very, very important problem, much more frequent than people think. In fact, very often lymphedema is mistaken for a venous problem, while it is often anything but. Let's explain what is lymphedema. The fluids in our body, and particularly in our extremities, arms and legs that is, have two ways back. One is the venous way, one is the lymphatic way. Often lymphatic is actually also known by ordinary people in general for what unfortunately happens to women after they undergo breast surgery. Women who undergo breast surgery often undergo either the removal of what Veronese made known as the sentinel lymph node, or the removal of all the lymph nodes, or the emptying of the axillary cavity. This somehow leads to a blockage of the lymphatic pathways, and in some women, fortunately only in a part, indeed in the limited percentage of women, to edema of the arm. That's lymphedema.
Here, Mr. Panzironi, this is Professor Angelo Santoliquido, and he basically explained to us that lymphedema is a condition that even doctors have a hard time recognizing.
Yes, it is true. It seems like an almost rare pathology, especially since we hardly hear about it even in the media. And this also results in less interest from those doctors who actually then should recognize and treat this pathology.
In fact, do you know roughly how many people suffer from it here in Italy?
We are talking about an army of 2 million people, and even in the world of 300 million, 40,000 new cases are diagnosed every year. And yet it must also be said that there are many more people who instead suffer from the beginning of lymphedema, which is a picture of a diagnosed state. So a condition that really affects millions and millions of people.
So let's go and see if official medicine, the so-called protocol medicine, has figured out what the causes of this disease are. We see it with this video.
Then lymphatic edema can be on a genetic basis, in the sense that the lymphatic pathways may develop less efficiently than they normally do. And this causes that if the lymphatic pathways are less developed, the leg swells. And this is lymphatic edema on a genetic basis. But sometimes lymphatic edema also comes for secondary reasons. Trauma can result in the appearance of lymphatic edema. Those who have had a major trauma at the level of the leg may have lymphatic edema as a secondary problem over time.
Here, it was Professor Santoliquido again who basically told us that he talked about a genetic aspect regarding lymphedema, and then he also told us that it can be caused by surgery or trauma. What do you think?
I can tell you that when medicine doesn't understand the causes of a disease, it always thinks it blames DNA, kind of like washing in the hands, right? But I mean, it is obvious that lymphedema can appear when there is a removal of lymph nodes, as it happens in operations precisely for the treatment of cancer or with lesions or the traumas of the legs. However, it must also be said that lymphedema is a progression of a pathology, so it is born with edema. So evidently there is something, not a trigger cause, but a concomitant cause that leads to this edema to turn into lymphedema.
So basically, official medicine is attacking the wrong enemy.
Well, of course, because the immune response obviously can lead to edema at the time when there is also an injury. We always have to wonder why that edema does not resolve. In fact, it even progresses to lymphedema, and this is simply due to other triggers, but which it seems that medicine does not know about. And unfortunately, this then also affects the type of care that this society, this official medicine, puts into practice that very often are also wrong.
Here, you mentioned treatment. I would like to see this video where you just talk about the treatment provided. So the protocol for this type of pathology, let's see it together.
For lymphatic edema, you have to have two people working. The one who prescribes what to do, but the one who does what to do. You have to have great dedication, great motivation, then you can get great results. I give an example. One of the things that is most often done in lymphatic edema is lymphatic drainage. That is lymphatic massage that deflates the leg. But if you do lymphatic drainage and do only that, the person who listens to us has done lymphatic drainage. He knows very well that if he does only that in the afternoon, he is fine. The next day, he is exactly the same as before. then to think that you can solve the problem with only one thing is unfeasible. Lymphedema requires the mechanical therapy, which is the lymphatic drainage, which has to be followed by compression therapy, because if you, after the lymphatic drainage, you don't do an elastic bandage or you don't wear a proper elastic stocking, and we have to talk about a big world of elastic stockings on this as well. In fact, you haven't achieved anything, because if you put the elastic stocking or the bandage, you prevent the reformation of the edema. If you don't do this, the next day it looks exactly the same as before.
Lymphatic drainage, bandaging, and some medication is what Professor Santoliquido told us for the treatment of lymphedema. What do you think?
If it were not really such a disabling condition and so present in populations, there would almost be I smile to see these professors going out of their way to try to find all kinds of solutions. Here I can tell you that this medicine is a little bit left over from the Middle Ages, even to lower the pressure they use leeches. Here we've even gone so far as to treat this condition with lymphatic drainage massages that tend to get rid of the lymph and then bandage the limb to keep it from swelling. I think that says it all.
It seems a somewhat archaic way to what is said to treat this kind of pathology. Also because being a degenerative pathology anyway, it gets worse with the years.
But of course, if we don't activate a whole series of preventions, but also treatments in a more systematic way, it is obvious that we fail to solve it, because we always act on the mechanical aspect of the problem, so on the effect and not on the cause. Well, this medicine has to understand that pathologies depend on poor nutrition. Again, even in the case of lymphedema.
Here, you mentioned poor nutrition, and I can tell you that practically, even though medicine has not well correlated nutrition to the occurrence, obviously, of this pathology, so cause and effect, however, it has understood that nutrition can worsen and exacerbate this kind of pathology. Then I show you this video.
Nutrition, let's go back to the initial talk. In the causes, obviously, overweight is an important problem. So nutrition is important in weight loss, but also in the accumulation of fluids, diet with too much salt, all the things that we more or less know with saturated fats. This certainly favors the sausages. This greatly favors the accumulation of fluids and therefore worsens. Because if we said that fluids have the lymphatic as a pathway, if the lymphatics don't work, if I make these fluids accumulate, worse the problem of the lymphatics.
So Mr. Panzironi, basically Professor Santoliquido basically advises us a diet low in sodium of saturated fat to avoid water retention and the problem of overweight. What do you think?
That, as usual, medicine always gets the wrong enemy to pick on. Because, of course, we know perfectly well that those foods they pointed out are certainly not responsible, but if anything, precisely those foods in the Mediterranean diet, such as bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes, rice, and legumes, which it seems to me the professor did not mention at all.
So basically all those foods that disrupt our immune system, as you said, bread, pasta, pizza, potatoes.
Well, we have explained very often how carbohydrates through insulin and aldosterone activate water retention, which seems to be one of the worsening factors of this pathology. But we also know that these foods are capable of altering our immune system. And a lot of research on lymphedema tells us that precisely in tissues that have this pathology, there is an excessive amount of the immune system called Th2 that tends to substantially remodel both the lymphatic system and induce an alteration of the lymphatic pumps that would allow the emptying of lymph. And so it is evident that then an alteration that is, say, maintained under these conditions is then more responsible, as in the case of insulin, for the multiplication of adipocytes, which are those cells that we find within the lymphedema. And then there is another important phenomenon, which is the increase of nitric oxide that goes to interact to disrupt the action of angiotensin, just this enzyme that allows us to activate just the lymphatic pumps.
Look, Panzironi, we know practically that lymphedema can be irreversible, so there has to be a permanent state of alteration of the immune system to then allow this condition to persist.
Absolutely. This is what official medicine should ask itself, not only the root cause, but to understand what remains, what is the alteration, and why that alteration continues to persist over time. Some research tells us that obviously the lymph is nothing but blood, without the red blood cells. So when we have an alteration in our blood sugar because of those foods that we have said 1,000 times, bread, pasta, and whatnot, we also have an increase in the amount of glucose within the lymph. And imagine what that means for these tissues where we have precisely this stagnant lymph, that they begin to be enriched in glucose, which are precisely that nutrient necessary for the development of the bacteria that use that as an energy substrate. And there you create the lymphangites, these chronic inflammations that tend to advance the pathology, also because they activate again the Th2, which is in charge precisely of the destruction of the bacteria. So on the one hand, these lymphangites, and on the other hand, the activation of insulin, as we said, acts in maturing and duplicating the adipocytes, which in turn continue to induce an inflammatory state. And so this means that there are a whole series of triggers always related to carbohydrates that induce both the onset and the maintenance and progression of lymphedema.
Thanks to our Adriano Panzironi for his explanation, for his insight. To continue with our focus, we have a guest. So directly from Bellizzi, in the province of Salerno, I would like to bring in Mrs. Agnese Iannone. Good evening, Mrs. Iannone. Please take a seat, and I would like to tell with you, of course, your story. Let's start about 30 years ago when you had surgery for breast cancer, exactly when it is.
Exactly in 1987, towards the end. Everything went well with the surgery, however, the trouble happened later.
Success. I know you had the removal, obviously, of the tumor of what exactly? Of the lymph nodes?
Of 6 lymph nodes, all of which were later found to be unharmed. There were no remote repeats, he said, so the doctor told me.
After a few months, you saw that your left arm and hand were beginning to have problems. What kind of problems were beginning to arise?
And became hard, like a boulder, heavy, and it was hurting me, so I could not move it at all. I couldn't do anything, almost nothing, let's say.
It had also swelled up, I guess.
Inflated, yes, inflated, and so I couldn't do backwards, not even lift it, because it weighed, and I couldn't even, let's say, put on a jacket. I mean, neither get dressed nor undressed. I needed help.
Of course, so this was preventing you from even the normal daily activities that one can have during the day. You surely must have been worried and went to ask a doctor. What did they tell you?
First, I went to the general practitioner, who actually sent me to another doctor at the hospital. Then they couldn't answer. They sent me to the emergency room, and there they couldn't figure out what it was. Eventually then, I was the one who suggested to the doctor I had so-so surgery, and I told him that it might be a consequence of this surgery. So they prescribed a treatment of injections to be done under the skin, right in the arm.
Under the skin, did this treatment work, these drugs they were giving you?
No, yes, it had no result. Then again, I went to another doctor. Eventually, they said I needed lymphatic drainage because the lymph had actually stagnated, and so it wasn't circulating.
So you obviously had lymphatic drainage massages and solved the problem?
It was, yes. No, not at all.
So it continued?
No, it continued. That is, for a little while it would reduce, let's say, in volume. However, after a few months it would return as before.
Of course, what kind of problems? First, you told us a little bit about what had happened to your arm. What kind of problems has it given you during all these years, these 30 years, though?
Big problems, because with this arm I couldn't lift anything, do anything, not even do... I was limited in doing housework, not even to pick up a pot to drain, let's say,
was prevented
pasta.
in all...
I could only do it with one arm.
But you, during this dramatic journey of 30 years, you will have listened and gone to some doctors, several doctors. How many?
And different ones. Yes, different doctors, but in the end, there is nothing to do. No, the only thing that is to do some of this therapy, cycles of lymphatic drainage, and that's it.
Is it true that recently then, this arm had become so hard that touching it felt like there were stones in it?
Yes, really hard. I couldn't lift. I couldn't even do, let's say, do basic, let's say, daily necessities.
Then you at some point know this broadcast, you know the health seeker. Do you want to tell how it happened?
Thanks to my son, really, that he was interested. One night he saw this program, he froze the remote control, and he saw just Adriano saying the real causes of these pathologies are pizza, bread, in short. And my son was, let's say, impressed. He said, yes, it's true, because he was already doing his investigations. And he started first, and after a few weeks, he started to feel better. And I was able to do that as well.
And you started following the Life 120 lifestyle in February 2018. After how long did you see the first improvements, the first benefits of this kind of lifestyle?
Almost, I won't say a week, a little month for sure. For sure, a little month, I realized that the first thing I realized was that I could move my arm so I could put my jacket on. That was really the first surprise.
So after a month or so, he saw that he was starting to remove the arm. So
he was then able to carry it even higher, so hand by hand, always improvements.
To get to October 2018, practically 8 months after she started following the Life 120 lifestyle, because she goes to her physiatrist who examined her and found that she had improved 90%, right? So, after 30 years, the doctor tells you, Mom, you have improved by 90%. How did you feel?
Like relieved, let's say, really. I really started to rejoice inside me. There is a joy. Still now I feel this joy that I want to share it with all of you.
It happened also a very peculiar thing, because obviously the physiatrist told you, but how did he achieve this kind of benefit? And you were telling the physiatrist, I follow a diet without... Tell us about it.
I exclude, that is, I don't eliminate, it's not that I eliminated, but so it's not more carbohydrate based, less carbohydrate and more protein, let's say. I eliminated these elements, foods, bread, pasta, pizza. Then he stayed as well, potatoes, also corn. Then he continued my, let's say, the list. And he made me understand that he was also following this diet, which was very, very favorable.
To this feeding, such that he told her that he also recommended it to his patients?
Yes,
this type of feeding? Yes. Then another thing, now we have seen that your arm has improved 90%. Now, after 15 months that you have reduced the swelling and everything else, how is your arm doing?
Aside from the fact that it has downsized a lot, so it has become softer, lighter, it certainly needs to be a little bit more, let's say, I even do activity now, a little bit of activity.
Do you know, is it true that she does now, except that she goes to the grocery store and takes the bags? Yes. Is it true that she also does weights with gymnastics following our Barbara on Life 120?
That's right, yes. I was afraid to do it because, no, he says, with the weight, because the doctor had told me no weights, no sun, no sea, no everything.
You instead went to the sea, so perfect. One last.
I went to mate last summer for a day, however, 4 or 5 hours in the sun without sunburn.
What now, when you touch your arm, still has it hard that it feels like there are stones?
No, in fact, nice and soft.
So I thank Mrs. Janum for being here.